Greetings, this is Greg. I want to talk about the origins of the North American P-51 Mustang and of North American. I know there have been a jillion books and videos about this plane. How likely is it that this video is going to bring you something new? Well, I actually think it's pretty likely because I haven't seen this stuff discussed before, not in print or video, and certainly not to this extent. We all know that the P-51 Mustang was built by a company called North American Aviation. But did you ever ask yourself, where did North American come from? Furthermore, how did they seemingly go from nothing to a company that could build one of the best fighters in the world in just a few years? They seemed to suddenly show up on the scene in 1935 with the ability to build all-metal, retractable gear, high-performance aircraft, and then they got a military contract almost immediately and they were off and running. They had never built an airplane before 1935, and by 1940 they had built and flown the B-25 Mitchell, and by the end of that year, the P-51 Mustang. How did a company like this form so quickly and become an established aviation powerhouse in such a short time? Well, the answer has a lot to do with Fokker. Yes, the Fokker that built German fighters in the First World War, including the famous DR-1 triplane. This is a long story, so you might want to pause and get yourself a drink. You see, after the war, Anthony Fokker, who by the way was a self-taught engineer, never finished high school. Anyway, after the war, the German government was going after him on criminal charges related to crashes of the Fokker D8, and for some huge amount of taxes they claimed he retroactively owed. This same sort of thing happened to Thomas Sopwith. This wasn't unusual at the time, nor was it limited to Germany. Rather than fight what he felt was an uphill battle, Anthony Fokker decided to return to the Netherlands, which we in the United States usually call Holland. This was his country of origin. When he went back to Holland, he managed to take train car loads of equipment with him, tooling, engines, aircraft, parts, and more. The planes, well over 100 of them, were mostly Fokker D7s, D8s, and C1s. The C1 is a recon version of the D7. Now, this certainly wasn't allowed. In fact, those D7s were part of the conditions of the armistice. They were specifically mentioned there. But he snuck them back into Holland via trains and barges. This picture is actually from that operation. Fokker planned the route and times out very carefully to avoid the authorities, and of course relied heavily on bribery. Anthony Fokker himself was very clear about that. Once he set up shop in Holland, he was able to start selling the planes he brought with them, mostly to Russia and Romania. Then he started work on new airplanes for the civilian market. This is the prototype F-7, which reminds me a lot of a World War I Fokker D-8 fighter plane, just bigger and in civilian form. This eventually became the F-7B, a trimotor, which, along with its variants, were among the most successful airplanes of the 1920s. Now, the timeline of events can be a bit confusing, and that's going to be true throughout this entire video. I found this article in the Los Angeles Times from October 30th, 1920. It clearly says that Anthony Fokker is coming to the U.S. on the Nordam, an ocean liner, because of interest in his planes. This is the only picture of the Nordam I could find, so we know he wasn't coming to the United States on vacation. I don't know what came from this visit specifically, but I do know that the next year in 1921 and also in 1922, Billy Mitchell, probably the most influential figure in U.S. military aviation at the time, visited Holland and was impressed by what he saw there. The result was that Mitchell gave Fokker a contract to build 135 DH-4s. Specifically, these were DH-4Ms with welded stainless steel structure instead of wood. One condition was that these planes had to be built in the United States. To complete the contract, Anthony Fokker leased an empty factory in New Jersey from Whittleman Lewis Corporation, who had been building some really odd stuff like this without much success. Now, I don't want to sound negative about the country of Holland. I truly like the place. It's got a great airport, lots of bicycles, the food is great, but it's a postage stamp size country. In an airplane, even an airplane back then, shortly after takeoff from Amsterdam, you can see border to border. In U.S. terms, Holland is 23 times smaller than the state of Oklahoma alone. It only made sense that Anthony Fokker would move to the United States. A relatively large portion of the world's air market was there, and he already had a factory in New Jersey, plus a government contract. So in 1923, that's just what he did. Around that time, he applied for U.S. citizenship and did in fact become a U.S. citizen. In the book Fokker, A Transatlantic Biography, which is pretty good, there's a quote from an interview with Anthony Fokker in the New York Times. It reads, quote, "The reason for my decision 2 years ago to become an American citizen was in order that I might devote the remainder of my career to the advancement of the aeronautical industry here," unquote. Those were not just words. He really did that. With the exception of some consulting work, all of Anthony Fokker's aviation efforts from this point until his death were focused on U.S. aviation. From 1920 to about 1929, the name and structure of Fokker's operation in the U.S. changed several times, but the simplified version is that the U.S. division of Fokker was for a time called Atlantic Aviation. In 1925, with the merging of two of Fokker's subsidiaries, Atlantic became Fokker Aircraft Corporation. Even after the name change, and there are a lot of name changes in this video, but even after that, it was common for people to refer to the airplanes as Atlantics or Atlantic Fokkers. I'm just calling them Fokkers to keep this simple, but keep in mind there were also Fokkers being built concurrently over in Holland, and the Fokker Aircraft Corporation in the United States handled the sales of those airplanes within the U.S. as well as the New Jersey-built Fokker. So this was all a bit convoluted. But Fokker was doing quite well, and for a time in the 1920s was the world's largest aircraft manufacturer, and they built many models like this Fokker Universal. Then they built an improved version called the Super Universal, which was famously used in the Byrd Antarctic expedition. During that adventure, the plane was picked up off the ground by hurricane-force winds. Fortunately, nobody was in it at the time, and it traveled on its own about half-mile and was destroyed by impact with the ground. I have heard that there may be efforts underway to recover the wreckage for a museum. They know where that wreckage is in Antarctica. Moving on, the airplane that probably most represents Fokker in the 1920s are their three-engine F-7s and variants. This one is actually an F-10. This airplane, and I mean this exact airplane, this serial number, not another Fokker F-10, was involved in a crash in 1931, which has a pretty big effect on this story, so I'll get to that. Now, Fokker's success in the 1920s didn't go unnoticed by the other titans of industry. Henry Ford joined in with the Ford Trimotor, which looks a lot like a Fokker Trimotor. However, the Fokker was made primarily of wood and the Ford primarily of metal. Ford also used construction techniques that appear to have been copied from the German company Junkers, and they lost 2 lawsuits over that exact issue. That is, Ford lost 2 lawsuits over that. It's pretty obvious to me that to come up with the Ford Trimotor, they took a really long look at what Fokker was doing and combined it with the construction methods from Junkers. Eventually, Ford would get out of the aircraft manufacturing for reasons that I haven't really seen discussed, but that's another video, and it's one I honestly don't plan on making. Moving on, back to Fokker. In 1927, Fokker changed the name of his U.S. company again, this time to Fokker Aircraft Corporation of America. He then went public with it and started selling stock in the company. General Motors, having seen what Ford was up to, also wanted to get into aviation. So when Fokker went public, GM showed up and crashed the party, buying controlling interest in Fokker's company in May of 1929. Meanwhile, down in Brazil, and trust me, this all leads to North American and the P-51 Mustang. We're going somewhere with all of this. Anyway, down in Brazil, there was a man named Edgar Schmood. Schmood was born in Germany. He worked as a mechanic during the First World War and was, like Anthony Fokker, an entirely self-taught engineer. He had no formal education in this area. Now, I'm not saying that in a negative way. I find it quite impressive. But guess who he was working for down in Brazil? General Motors, who at this point owned Fokker. GM liked Schmood, and they brought him to the United States. It wasn't as simple as that, of course. GM had to take care of the immigration stuff, but they did it and put Schmood right to work at Fokker in February of 1930. Once at Fokker in New Jersey, Schmood found himself surrounded by Dutch and German co-workers. When not at work, he took classes in English and quickly mastered the language and adapted very well to the work at Fokker. Soon, however, there was a disaster in 1931. That was the year of the plane crash I mentioned earlier. This plane crashed in Kansas. There were no survivors, and one of the passengers was a celebrity, very well-known individual. Specifically, he was the head coach of the Notre Dame football team. For my foreign viewers, because I don't know if this is uniquely an American thing or not, but some coaches within the education system here in the United States are celebrities. I'm not talking about professional sports. I'm talking about coaches at colleges and universities. Now, Notre Dame isn't a public school, but just as an example, the highest paid public sector employees in almost every state in the United States are football coaches. You have to go really far down this list to find one that isn't, and then it's usually a basketball coach. In almost all cases, it's a university employee, except in New Hampshire, where it's the chief medical examiner. To say that this crash, which involved a prominent college football coach, was a big deal would be an understatement. It damaged Fokker's reputation considerably, and probably did more to move aircraft production in the United States away from wood and towards metal than any other single event in aviation history. Now, at this point, Fokker had already been moving towards metal construction with a serious effort on reducing drag. This prototype fighter from 1932 has no external rivets on the fuselage. All of the metal panels are bent and joined in such a way that the rivets are on the inside. This plane was called by one of two names, the Fokker AF-18 or the General Aviation XFA. General Aviation Corporation, or GAC, was the new name for GM's aviation division, which was really just Fokker renamed. That's important to keep in mind. You will see airplanes from this period with multiple names. However, everybody was calling the planes built by GM Fokkers, which makes sense. The public knew who Fokker was, but in terms of aircraft, GM just didn't register. Anthony Fokker himself was kept on after the GM buyout in 1929 as director of engineering, but he found it very difficult to adapt to not being the one calling the shots, and he left the company in 1931. From that point on, Anthony Fokker lived a pretty good life on his yachts, which apparently he really enjoyed, and he spent a lot of time in the affluent social circles of the United States until his death in New York at the age of only 49. That was in 1939. So the situation at GM was starting to look a bit dire in terms of aviation. The Fokker product line was aging, and at a time when aircraft technology was advancing rapidly. The name Fokker was tarnished because of the crash, and sales were drying up. Plus, Anthony Fokker himself was gone. Whatever you may think of Anthony Fokker, and he certainly has his detractors, but it's indisputable that he was a good engineer, and he was even better at recruiting and motivating other engineers. He was also quite adept at the political and sales aspects of operating a big company, and he seemed very good at grasping victory from the jaws of defeat. He did that several times. Without him in the picture, GM's aviation division was starting to flounder. Around this time, and now we're up to 1933, General Motors purchased North American Aviation. I'm sure you know the name North American. What you probably didn't know is that in 1933 they had not designed, let alone built, a single airplane. In fact, they were not an aircraft manufacturer, nor had they ever made an attempt to be one. North American was a holding company that primarily dealt in the field of aviation. It was founded by Clement Melville Keyes. He was one of the characters, let's say, of early aviation. Suffice to say, he was kicked out of North American for embezzlement about a year before the GM buyout. Interestingly, Eddie Rickenbacker, the World War I U.S. Ace of Aces and Medal of Honor recipient, had been working at General Motors, and he was the one who convinced them to buy North American. He actually figured into the North American story even earlier, but I'm going to leave the Rickenbacker part of the story out of this because it's just too long of a side road to go down. At this point, GM decided to merge all of their aviation interests into one company under one name. Of course, they had three somewhat established names to choose from. General Aviation Corporation, which just didn't seem to be a name that was getting any traction. Fokker, which was not only a tarnished name in the U.S., it had an extra complication. Fokker, no longer under Anthony Fokker, but Fokker was still building airplanes in Europe. That was a separate company, but having two different companies named Fokker probably would have caused some marketing confusion. So they used the name North American, which I think was a good call. Hence, North American is really Fokker, just renamed by General Motors for the second time. If you watch promotional videos from North American from the 1940s or 50s, they will state that North American began selling aircraft in 1934. They usually don't make any references to the company that did exist before that. Now, that's a very carefully worded statement, began selling in 1934. It sort of implies that they were selling North American aircraft in 1934, which also implies that they must have been around as a manufacturer for at least some time before that. What actually happened is that GM purchased yet another aviation company called American Pilgrim. They were working on this airplane. This is the General Aviation GA-43. General Aviation, previously called Fokker, made Edgar Schmood. Remember, he is the engineer brought up from Brazil. Anyway, they made him the project engineer for this airplane. Edgar Schmood said of this project, quote, "Although it was not a very striking piece of design, it gave me at least a chance to organize and run a project," unquote. 5 of these airplanes were built, only 5, probably in 1933 to 1934. The Wikipedia page for this plane says that it was the first aircraft built by North American. I beg to differ. There are very few period references to this airplane, and none reference North American as the manufacturer. This 1934 issue of Aviation Week, which clearly calls it a GA-43 in 2 separate places, GA, again, for General Aviation. This magazine also has all the specs for the airplane, which is kind of nice. The only reference to North American in this entire issue is in regards to airmail legislation. I'll put this magazine up in the Patreon section. Now, on that subject, if this is the type of content you enjoy, please like and subscribe. Consider joining my Patreon. I have a lot of stuff there. Period magazines in PDF form, always in full color, or full color for the period. Magazines back then would use color on some pages and black and white on others. I also have aircraft manuals there, resource materials, and more. And I have polls there to help determine the direction of the channel. And of course, I answer all questions there. Back to our story. The only airline to operate this plane was Swissair, and they called them GA-43s. Plus, they crashed one, and the accident report calls it a GA-43 and lists General Aviation as the manufacturer. In short, nobody called this a North American aircraft in 1934. I think what happened is, at some later date, marketing or public relations people from North American needed to come up with the company's history and look back to find the earliest plane that they could possibly tie to North American, and they went with that. Now, I don't know where the GA-43s were built. I do have one picture of it in the factory, but I haven't been able to match this up to any known location. I think they were built in Maryland. I'm pretty sure of that. After Anthony Fokker left, GM moved the factory from Teterboro, New Jersey to a new location about 5 miles from Boston's Logan Airport. This Maryland plant was where they built the last of the planes that were designed while Anthony Fokker was still there, and they were flying boats for the Coast Guard. In 1935, GM moved North American Aviation to Inglewood, California. This was done for a number of reasons. A large portion of the U.S. aviation industry was already there. A big advantage was the weather. Far more days would be available for flight testing, which in turn would speed up development of new models. Furthermore, the cost of doing business was far lower in California at that time due to lower real estate costs and decreased heating costs for the factory. When North American moved to California, many of the employees went with them. A lot of the same people who had been working there from the time when it was still called Fokker were at North American at the Inglewood plant. These included Edgar Schmood, although he did take a very short detour over to Belanca, but I think he was only there a matter of weeks. Now back at North American, he was living in California, and he would eventually become one of the key figures in the P-51's design. Many others made the move to California with North American as well. These included Vance Breese, who had worked for Fokker and would be the first P-51 test pilot. North American had the new factory up and running and turning out modern airplanes inside of a year. The best I can determine is that they started there with about 250 factory workers, about 75 of which came with them from the Teterboro factory. So they still had a core of the old Fokker employees with them. North American also brought in very talented engineers and designers with experience at other aircraft companies like Douglas Aircraft and the Glenn L. Martin Company. The first airplane built by North American was the O-47 observation plane. This plane was designed in 1934 by General Aviation Manufacturing, which you may recall was actually a Fokker. Initially, the plane was called the General Aviation GA-15. It went into production as the North American O-47, and a couple hundred were built over several years. The real initial success for North American was in training aircraft, starting with the NA-16. There were various models of trainers from North American. They continually improved their designs, and they got bigger, and they had all sorts of changes, including increasingly more and more metal skin. The ultimate World War II era trainer from North American was the T-6 Texan. Over 15,000 of these were built. Now, they didn't only build trainers. They built a bomber prototype, the turbocharged XB-21, which then led to this airplane, the NA-40. Now, they only built one of each of these two planes, but these designs led to the B-25, which of course turned out to be one of the best bombers of World War II. North American did try building a fighter in the late 1930s. This became the P-64. Only 13 were built, didn't really go anywhere. Their bread and butter airplanes before the P-51 were primarily the Texan, and then in 1940 it started to be the B-25. Still, they wanted to build a fighter, and an opportunity arose. The British wanted more P-40s. But production was maxed out at Curtiss, the P-40 manufacturer, so in February of 1940, they asked James Kindleberger, who was the head of North American at the time, if North American could build P-40s for them. Now, Kindleberger was quite a character. He was a high school dropout and a World War I pilot. He took engineering courses via correspondence and ended up working as an engineer at Martin and at Douglas. He was actually president of Douglas Aircraft at one point. Everyone called him Dutch, which I think is ironic because he was running a company that was being run by Anthony Fokker, a Dutchman, just a few years earlier. Anyway, Kindleberger told the British he could have a better fighter than the P-40, a clean sheet design, on budget, and with a prototype flying in only 4 months, which was less time than he said it would take him to set up production of P-40s. The end result was that Kindleberger wasn't just boasting, he and North American delivered. So, to answer the original question I asked at the start of the video, how did North American go from a company that had never even tried to produce an airplane to an industry leader in so little time? The answer is because North American was essentially Fokker. Within a very short period, just a few years, General Motors had renamed their aviation company twice and moved the factory twice, but ultimately what they still had in terms of experience and expertise in 1936 or thereabouts was the company they purchased, Fokker. Edgar Schmood, again the project leader on the P-51, literally worked for Fokker, and with the exception of a very short period at Belanca, worked there through all of the name and factory changes until he led the P-51 Mustang project. Many North American employees were working at Fokker Aircraft under Anthony Fokker when GM bought them out, and were still there in Inglewood, California when they built P-51 Mustangs. It's a bit of a stretch, but not too much, to say that in 1940, North American was literally Fokker rebranded. I suppose normally when two companies merge, there is some question of the true pedigree or identity of the new company. But it's a bit different with North American, because when GM bought Fokker and merged them with the GM Aviation Division, few even knew GM had an aviation division. I'm sure most of you can name some pre-1929 Fokker aircraft, but how many pre-1929 GM aircraft can you think of? Probably none. It's obvious that General Aviation Corporation was just Fokker rebranded. That's not to say that changes weren't made. GM did a lot with this company. New people were hired. There was certainly a big infusion of cash. But the bones of the company, in terms of aircraft engineering and production, came from Fokker. Then when they merged with North American, well, there can't be any question of who the aircraft manufacturer was in that deal. North American basically contributed the name and presumably some accounting and marketing skills, but the engineering and manufacturing capabilities of the American aircraft company that built the P-51, North American, came from Fokker. Now, to close this out, I should say that over in Europe, Fokker continued building airplanes, although Anthony Fokker wasn't really a part of that operation after about 1922. During World War II, the Dutch Fokker company built the excellent Bucher 181, which was a trainer for the Luftwaffe. This is the plane flown in the movie Great Escape, and from what I hear, it was a wonderfully good flying airplane. Fokker continued building airplanes after the war, but eventually went bankrupt in 1990. Their last plane was the Fokker F-100. Today there are several companies in Europe that carry the Fokker name. They don't build aircraft. They are mostly parts suppliers that had a relationship with Fokker before they closed down as an aircraft manufacturer. Then there is Reckhoff. Reckhoff is Fokker spelled backwards. This is a company, Reckhoff Aircraft, that claimed they were going to start up production of some Fokker aircraft. The project never really went anywhere and in my view can't succeed with their proposed product line. It's my opinion that this may have been a scam to get government money. At North American, things didn't look too good after World War II ended. They had all their eggs in the military basket, and orders for their planes were being canceled left and right. Just before the end of the war, they had orders for 8,000 aircraft, which dropped to only 24 aircraft shortly after the war's end. They had massive layoffs. Their workforce was reduced from over 90,000 to about 5,000 in very short time, a matter of months. GM separated themselves from North American. However, North American did have some things going for them. It may not have been immediately apparent, but pretty soon it was. The advent of the jet age meant that every military fighter in the world was either obsolete or was about to be. The current inventories would have to be replaced with new jets, and North American hit a real home run with the F-86 Sabre. I think this was the most produced Western jet fighter ever. In any case, it was a huge success. North American had many successes in the jet age, and after numerous mergers and name changes, the company has now been absorbed into Boeing, who has proven to be the master of the workings of the military-industrial complex. That's all for now. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day. Goodbye.